Good evening. I hope you've got your lights dimmed, your water bottle nearby, and absolutely zero plans for tomorrow morning. Because tonight, we're diving into something far more suspicious than your neighbor's Wi-Fi network name. We're exploring the kind of American mystery that refuses to die, no matter how hard the authorities try to bury it. Here's what we're doing. For the next 18 minutes, you're going to be a small-town amateur detective with insomnia and a concerning amount of access to archived newspapers. You're going to follow a thread that nobody else wanted to pull. You're going to learn about 5 men who walked out of reality somewhere between Pennsylvania and the kind of desperation that only a long-haul truck driver understands at 3 in the morning. But before we begin, here's the housekeeping bit. If you actually find yourself enjoying this particular descent into vehicular strangeness and you want to hear more tales of roads that shouldn't exist and disappearances that make absolutely no logical sense, would you kindly smash that subscribe button? Like this video if it keeps you company during insomnia hours. And in the comments, I'm genuinely curious, tell me where you're watching from. Are you in a truck right now? Are you at home, lights off, questioning every decision that led to this moment? Let me know. These conversations matter more than the algorithm will ever admit. Now, here's something funny. Nothing bad ever happens when a fan is running, right? That's what we tell ourselves. The white noise, the cool air, the gentle reminder that at least something in the universe is functioning with predictable mechanical consistency. Maybe turn one on right now. You'll need the comfort. So let me ask you some absurd questions to hook you into this particular rabbit hole. What did people do before fingerprint powder and surveillance cameras? How did they just disappear? How suspicious is too suspicious? Why is it that when humans realize they're in danger, they run like they've never used their legs before and are experimenting with them for the very first time? And here's the real one. What happens to the men who see something on a dark road that their minds cannot process? Congratulations. You've just woken up in the middle of a cold case that refuses to stay cold. It's 1975. You're about to learn why certain stretches of American highway have earned the right to be feared. Let's set the scene. 1975, the United States was still shaking off the 70s in that uniquely American way that involved questionable fashion choices and a collective agreement to never speak of Vietnam. People were driving cross-country. The interstate system was still relatively new, still carrying that sense of freedom and possibility. And along Route 40, stretching through central Pennsylvania like a scar through history, truckers were running loads between Maryland and Ohio, night after night, in that meditative state that comes only from 16 hours behind the wheel. You need to understand something about long-haul trucking in 1975. It wasn't a job for people who required constant stimulation. The radio played the same songs on repeat. The road was your companion. The hum of your engine was your meditation. You learned to talk to yourself. You learned to distinguish between the tiredness that kills and the tiredness that just makes life feel surreal. Most drivers developed a rhythm, a relationship with the darkness, almost a friendship with insomnia. But there was a particular stretch of Route 40, between Breezewood and Cove Gap, where that friendship deteriorated. Every trucker knew it the same way you know when you're being watched. Not because of evidence. Not because of logic. But because something in your nervous system recognizes it before your conscious mind catches up. This stretch, about 40 miles of road that should have been completely unremarkable, had earned a reputation. It was the kind of reputation that got whispered between drivers at truck stops, mentioned casually, then immediately dismissed as superstition. Drivers are superstitious people. They touch the dashboard before turning onto unfamiliar roads. They avoid certain routes on certain days. They carry photographs, talismans, lucky socks that haven't been washed since 1972 for reasons nobody can articulate. But this was different. There was a rest stop on this stretch. Not an official one. The kind that existed in a legal gray area, built partially on private property, maintained by nobody in particular, used by everyone because there were no other options for 60 miles in either direction. The crossing, people called it. Not because there was anything particularly special about the landscape, it was just another Pennsylvania rest stop, All concrete and fluorescent lights that seemed to flicker in a pattern that almost made sense if you stared long enough. Here's what made it unusual. The rest stop appeared on some maps and not on others. GPS wasn't invented yet, obviously, so everyone relied on paper maps, and the quality of those maps varied wildly. Some maps showed the crossing clearly. Others left it off entirely. This inconsistency wasn't remarked upon. It was just accepted, the way you accept that some stores have bathrooms and others don't. It's just part of the landscape. Between 1975 and early 1976, 5 men would enter that rest stop and never emerge. Their trucks would be found hours later, parked exactly where they left them, engines running, driver's side doors hanging open, thermoses of coffee still warm on the dashboard. There were no signs of struggle. There was no blood. There was just absence, the kind of absence that absence specializes in, complete, thorough, and absolutely unapologetic. Here's where we have to talk about pattern recognition, which is simultaneously the most useful and most dangerous skill the human brain possesses. Pattern recognition is what keeps you alive. It's how you notice the car following you 3 turns too long. It's how you know someone is lying before they've finished the sentence. It's also what makes you see a face in a kitchen towel and become absolutely certain you've discovered something paranormal. But this pattern was different. This pattern had a body count. The first disappearance was James Kittredge. 42 years old, driving a fully loaded semi-trailer carrying industrial equipment heading toward Columbus. He called his dispatcher at 2:47 a.m., reported he was pulling into the crossing for a quick break. Said he was tired. Said the radio was acting weird. Said there was something strange about the place, but nothing he could articulate clearly. The dispatcher, her name was Eleanor, and we'll get to her in a moment, asked if he wanted her to call ahead to the next station. He said no. He'd be fine. He just needed 15 minutes. He never checked back in. 4 hours later, the company sent a driver to investigate. They found his truck idling at the edge of the rest stop parking lot, doors open, lights on, the engine running with the kind of persistence that suggested James Kittredge had simply stepped out and forgotten to turn it off. There was a coffee cup in the cup holder, still warm. A cigarette smoldering in the ashtray, burned down to the filter. His wallet was on the seat. His keys were in the ignition. His jacket was hanging on the back of the driver's seat. It was as if James Kittredge had been digitally removed from reality while his possessions remained behind, still maintaining the fiction that he would return. The police arrived. They found nothing. No evidence of foul play, no tire marks suggesting a struggle, no witnesses because the rest stop was empty except for James's truck. They filed a report. Missing person. Unexplained circumstances. That was 2 weeks before the second truck driver failed to check in. The second was Michael Pritchard, 38, carrying frozen fish from Boston heading to Pittsburgh. He called in at 2:52 a.m. He was taking a break at the crossing. He sounded tired but normal. Nothing unusual in his voice. He said he'd call back when he was ready to roll. He never did. When they found his truck 20 hours later, it was the same scenario. Engine running. Doors open. Coffee warm. Cigarette burning in the ashtray, completely consumed by ash now, suggesting it had been burning for hours without anyone to notice. 2 disappearances in the same place within 14 days created concern. The police started interviewing other truckers. Did anyone else stop at the crossing? Had anyone else experienced anything unusual? And here's where the pattern began to crystallize in a way that couldn't be dismissed anymore. 17 truckers reported stopping at the crossing during that same period. 17. And every single one of them reported the same inexplicable experience. The radio wouldn't work properly. All stations sounded like static or strange distortions. Every one of them reported seeing a figure, a woman, they thought, though they couldn't say why, standing at the entrance to the rest stop. A woman in a white coat. Never moving. Never blinking. Always present. And every one of them reported feeling an overwhelming compulsion to leave. A primal warning system that screamed at them to get back in their trucks and keep driving, no matter how tired they were. 16 of them listened to that warning. One didn't. The third disappearance happened on March 14th, Robert Chen, 35, hauling automotive parts to New Jersey. He called in at 2:44 a.m. According to the dispatch recording, which state police would later examine dozens of times, Robert said, "This place is wrong. There's something fundamentally wrong here, and I can't explain it, but I'm getting out. I'm driving. I don't care how tired I am." He never made his next check-in call. His truck was found at the crossing. Same scenario. Same eerie stillness. Same absence of everything except the physical evidence that he'd been there. The investigation intensified. State police set up a stakeout. They parked officers at the crossing, trying to catch whatever was happening in real time. For 6 days, officers sat in unmarked cars, monitoring the area. Nothing happened. No truck drivers came through. The rest stop remained empty except for the law enforcement presence, and the moment the police left, thinking they'd wasted time and resources, the fourth driver disappeared. This was April 2nd. David Westbrook, 41, carrying building supplies to Altoona. He'd been warned. Eleanor, the dispatcher, had heard through the trucker community about the disappearances. She told David to avoid the crossing, to drive an extra 40 minutes if he needed to find a different route. David had been dismissive. He'd been driving Route 40 for 19 years. He wasn't going to be spooked by rumors and superstition. His truck was found at the crossing at 6 a.m., surrounded by empty patrol cars. The officers had finally left their positions. And in that 30-minute window, David Westbrook ceased to exist within physical reality. The fifth and final disappearance came on May 8th. Thomas Bellamy, 53, heading to Harrisburg with a trailer full of industrial machinery. Thomas called in at 2:51 a.m. He was stopping at the crossing. The moment his dispatcher told him not to, told him to keep driving, find another rest stop, do anything except stop at the crossing, Thomas laughed and said the place couldn't be that bad. He was an old-timer. He'd seen it all. Nothing scared him. Eleanor, the dispatcher, said something to Thomas before he hung up. She said they weren't scared either. Thomas Bellamy's truck was found empty the next morning, exactly like the others. Exactly like all the others. And after that, the disappearances stopped. Completely. Utterly. As if whatever had been harvesting truck drivers in that location had simply finished what it came to do. Now we need to talk about Eleanor, because she's the person who actually documented what was happening while everyone else was fumbling around with official procedures and police protocols. Eleanor had been working the night dispatch shift for Crestwood Trucking Company since 1968. She was the voice in the radio, the person who knew every driver's call sign, who noticed when somebody's tone changed, who could tell the difference between normal tiredness and the kind of fear that makes your vocal cords tighten. She was, essentially, the nervous system of the entire operation. Eleanor was also the type of person who kept meticulous notes. Not just the official logs that the company required, the times, the destinations, the cargo weights. She kept personal journals of the calls she received. She noted unusual patterns. She tracked seasonal variations in driver behavior. She was, without knowing it, engaging in the kind of data analysis that wouldn't become standard practice in logistics for another 30 years. When James Kittredge disappeared, Eleanor noted the time of his last call, his vocal tone, the exact words he'd used. When Michael Pritchard failed to check in, Eleanor compared his call to James's call. The patterns were identical. The timing was identical. The emotional tenor was identical. By the time the third driver disappeared, Eleanor was convinced that something systemic was happening at the crossing. She began to track every call from drivers who reported passing through or stopping at the crossing. She created a matrix of information, the time of day, the driver's emotional state, the exact radio frequency the call came in on, whether the driver reported any abnormalities with their vehicle or the landscape. What Eleanor discovered was damning in its specificity. Every single driver who vanished reported calling in between 2:40 and 2:55 a.m. Every single driver reported radio distortions. Every single driver reported seeing the woman in white. And most importantly, every driver who reported seeing the woman in white but ignored their instinct to leave made it out fine, except for the ones who didn't. Eleanor's notes show something else too, something more disturbing. The drivers who saw the woman in white and kept driving, the ones who listened to their survival instinct, all reported the same thing. They reported that when they looked in their rearview mirror, the woman in white was closer than she'd been before. Not walking toward them. Not moving in any conventional sense. Just closer. As if distance was a suggestion that didn't apply to her. Eleanor compiled everything into a report. She presented it to her supervisor. She presented it to the police. She even tried to present it to the state investigative committee that was formed after the fourth disappearance. And nobody wanted to hear it. Because Eleanor's data suggested something that nobody was equipped to address, that the crossing wasn't just the location of a crime. It was the crime itself. There was a diner called Maggie's Place, about 30 miles before the crossing, located right off Route 40 at a junction that served as an unofficial gathering point for long-haul drivers. The diner had been in the same location since 1954, run by Margaret Whitfield, a woman who had seen approximately 10,000 truckers pass through her establishment and had developed an almost supernatural ability to read human character in the time it took to order eggs. Margaret knew about the crossing before the disappearances happened. Everyone in the community knew about it. But Margaret's knowledge went deeper than gossip. Margaret had her own stories, her own history with the place. She'd been a waitress at a restaurant that used to occupy the land where the crossing rest stop was built. This was in 1951, before the current rest stop was constructed. She remembered the night the old building burned down. She remembered the people who didn't make it out. She remembered how the authorities had classified it as an accident, but Margaret had always thought it was something else. She thought it was a closure of some kind, a sealing off. When the new rest stop was constructed in 1959, Margaret watched it happen. She watched the workers pour the concrete and install the infrastructure. And she watched the moment the place became wrong. She could pinpoint it, she claimed. It was the moment they hit something about 50 feet down. Something that wasn't supposed to be there. Something old. The construction crew kept digging. They pulled up remnants of something. Margaret never found out what. Nobody would tell her. The pieces were removed, the hole was filled, and the rest stop was completed as if nothing had happened. But from that moment forward, Margaret had a policy. When truckers would come into her diner, tired, strung out on coffee and pills and the desperation of the road, Margaret would study them. She had a sense about people, a kind of intuition that comes from decades of observing human behavior. She would know, sometimes within moments, whether they were going to survive the crossing. The ones she thought might not make it, she would warn personally. She'd ask about their route. She'd ask if they were stopping at the crossing. And if they said yes, she'd look them in the eye and say something cryptic. Something like, "Don't stop there tonight. Drive until you reach the next town. It doesn't matter how tired you are." Some drivers listened. Most drivers didn't. They dismissed her as a superstitious old woman with a coffee stain on her apron and opinions about things beyond her understanding. But if you look at the records, if you compare Margaret's interactions with specific drivers against the official disappearance logs, a pattern emerges. The 5 men who vanished. None of them had ever stopped at Maggie's Place. None of them had ever received Margaret's warning. The drivers who saw her face before stopping at the crossing, who heard her version of caution delivered with the indifference of someone who had made peace with forces beyond explanation, made it through. Margaret never formally documented anything. She didn't keep records. She just served coffee, delivered warnings in the tone of casual conversation, and lived with the knowledge that she could only protect people who walked into her diner. The rest of them, the ones who drove straight through to the crossing without her intervention, were on their own. When the 5th truck driver disappeared, the state police could no longer characterize this as coincidence or isolated incidents. 5 disappearances at the same location within 3 months was a pattern that demanded explanation. A task force was assembled. The FBI sent consultants. Local investigators who'd spent decades working missing persons cases were brought in. What they discovered was that they had absolutely nothing to work with. There was no evidence of foul play. There were no bodies. There were no ransom notes. There were no witnesses except for the testimony of other truckers, all of whom reported the same impossible thing: a woman who was always closer than she should be, radio static that sounded almost like language, and an overwhelming compulsion to flee. You can't charge a woman in white with a crime. You can't file a warrant for a voice that sounds like it exists between radio stations. You can't even begin the investigation process with these kinds of leads because they're not leads at all. They're hallucinations shared among people under extreme stress and sleep deprivation. The official theory, eventually presented to the public, was that the drivers had suffered from individual psychological breaks. The stress of the road, the isolation, the exhaustion, it had all combined into a perfect storm of mental dysfunction. Perhaps they'd abandoned their vehicles and walked into the woods, succumbing to hypothermia or becoming lost. Perhaps they'd chosen to disappear, fabricated new identities, and started over somewhere else, driven by some subconscious impulse that the investigators couldn't access. But these theories fell apart when you actually examined them. 5 separate men, none of them known to have mental health issues, all exhibiting the exact same behavioral pattern, all disappearing in the exact same way, on the exact same stretch of road, at the exact same time of night. The investigators interviewed Eleanor. They looked at her notes. And they decided that Eleanor had engaged in the kind of pattern seeking that confirmation bias enables. She had unconsciously shaped the data to support a predetermined conclusion. She had become invested in the narrative of the mysterious rest stop, and her observations had become tainted by that investment. Eleanor tried to argue. She had records. She had objective data. She had the testimony of 17 different drivers. But by that point, the investigators had already decided that this case was unsolvable through conventional means, which meant it was unsolvable, period. The case was officially closed on November 3, 1976. The classification was unexplained disappearances with insufficient evidence for criminal investigation. This is bureaucrat speak for we have no idea what happened, we're tired, we're going home, and we're filing this under not our problem anymore. The crossing remained operational. The rest stop continued to function. Drivers continued to stop there, continued to experience the radio distortions and see the woman in white and feel the overwhelming compulsion to leave. But they left, because they'd heard the stories, because Margaret had whispered warnings in her diner, because Eleanor's notes had circulated through the trucker community through those informal networks that exist outside official channels. No more disappearances occurred. It was as if whatever inhabited that location had satisfied whatever hunger it possessed. After 1976, nothing. The story simply ended, not with resolution but with the kind of silence that silence specializes in, the silence of things nobody wants to discuss. The rest stop, the crossing, gradually became less popular. Truck drivers began to avoid it, whether out of fear or superstition or simply because they'd heard rumors. The official reports discouraged stopping there without specifically saying why. The company that maintained the facility gradually reduced service. The bathrooms were cleaned less frequently. The lighting became dimmer. The whole place developed the aesthetic of an institution slowly being abandoned by the consensus of practical people who had decided, collectively, that its existence was no longer necessary. In 1979, the decision was made to officially demolish the crossing. The reasons given were structural integrity concerns and outdated facilities. The real reason, or so people whispered, was that the state wanted the location erased. Not investigated further, not studied, not even acknowledged, just removed from the landscape entirely. The demolition was completed in the spring of 1979. The concrete was broken up. The buildings were dismantled. The entire footprint of the crossing was systematically eliminated. Grass was planted. The landscape was restored as much as possible to its pre-development state. But here's the thing about erasing something from the physical world: the absence becomes another kind of presence. The area around where the crossing used to be developed a reputation among locals. People reported that if you drove past the location at certain times of night, you could still see the structure. Not a real structure, not something that would show up on a photograph, but something visible in that peripheral vision space where your brain tries to make sense of incomplete information. You could see the outline of the building. You could see the parking lot. You could see the lights that had been demolished decades ago. The road in that location was rerouted shortly after the demolition. The original alignment was abandoned, allowed to deteriorate. Eventually, the state began an official reroute project that moved the main traffic flow several miles south, away from the location where the crossing had been. But there are still roads connecting to the original route. There are still paths through that landscape. And every few years, a driver reported stopping at a rest stop that shouldn't exist in a location that had been erased. They reported a woman in white. They reported radio distortions. They reported the overwhelming need to leave. And they left. Here's what we know. Here's what we can document. Here's what exists in the official record, and Eleanor's notes, and Margaret's memories, and the testimony of 17 surviving drivers. 5 men disappeared from a location that no longer exists. Their disappearance was never explained. Their absence became the only evidence that they'd ever been real at all. The location was deliberately demolished and erased from the landscape. The official narrative was established as a closed case, classified as unsolvable, archived in the way that bureaucracies archive things they want to forget. The matter was declared resolved by being declared irrelevant. But every few years, without fail, a driver reports something. A truck driver traveling through central Pennsylvania at 2:47 a.m., one of the exact times when the original disappearances occurred, reports calling for help on a radio frequency that shouldn't exist anymore. He reports seeing a rest stop at a location that's been empty grass for 45 years. He reports a woman in white, always closer than she should be, never moving in ways that human physics allows. He reports calling into a dispatcher who sounds like she's been dead for decades. He reports hearing Eleanor's voice, asking him for his location, his route, the direction he's heading. He reports her asking him if he's going to make it through. In 2003, a truck driver named Robert Mitchell reported his entire truck being transported to the original location of the crossing. He pulled over because his GPS was malfunctioning. When he got out to check his equipment, he noticed his surroundings looked wrong. The landscape was from 1975. The rest stop was standing, fully operational, illuminated by lights that shouldn't have been powered for almost 30 years. He reported seeing 5 trucks parked in the lot, their engines running, their doors open, exactly as they'd been found on the mornings after each disappearance. When he reported this, he was speaking to a dispatcher who wasn't using official channels. She was reaching him on a frequency that predated modern radio protocol. And when he asked what was happening, she told him, "They never left, honey. They're still parked there, waiting for the roads to finish changing." In 2011, a trucker reported stopping at a completely empty landscape, no rest stop, no buildings, just grass and darkness, and seeing a woman in white standing where the entrance to the crossing used to be. He reported that she was looking directly at him, and that her eyes contained the gaze of someone who had been waiting for 45 years for the roads to lead someone back to her. In 2019, an Uber driver reported picking up a passenger on a dark road in central Pennsylvania. The passenger was a man in his 70s, dressed in clothing from the 1970s. He gave an address in Columbus. When the driver reached the specified destination, the passenger told him he'd been on the road for 44 years. When the driver looked in the rearview mirror to respond, the passenger was gone. He was never there. Eleanor passed away in 2003. But her notes still exist. They're archived in a library that doesn't advertise their location. Margaret died in 1998, but drivers still report stopping at a diner that was demolished in 2001, seeing a woman who looks exactly like Margaret's photograph from 1975, and receiving warnings about the crossing from someone who's been dead for more than 2 decades. The case remains officially closed. The disappearances remain officially unexplained. The location remains officially erased. But the echoes that linger in the space between radio stations, in the moments just before 3 a.m., in that peripheral vision space where your brain tries to process things that shouldn't exist, those echoes refuse to fade. And somewhere on Route 40, during certain nights when the conditions align in ways that nobody quite understands, 5 trucks are still idling in a parking lot that was demolished 45 years ago. Their engines are still running. Their doors are still open. Their coffee is still warm. And they're waiting for the roads to lead someone back. There you have it. 5 men. 1 location. 1 mystery that was deliberately erased from the official record while simultaneously refusing to disappear from the landscape of American folklore. The rational explanation is that these men succumbed to a combination of fatigue, stress, and the kind of shared delusion that can occur when people are living in crisis. The official explanation is that the case was unsolvable and therefore irrelevant. The explanation that the evidence suggests, the one that Eleanor spent her remaining years documenting, is far more unsettling. Some locations are older than the roads we build through them. Some presences predate the infrastructure we construct. And sometimes, when we decide to erase a place, we don't make it cease to exist. We just make it exist in a different way, in the static between radio stations, in the moments between consciousness and sleep, in the spaces that maps refuse to show. If you're driving through central Pennsylvania late at night, and you see a rest stop that isn't quite on your route, that doesn't appear on your GPS, that feels somehow fundamentally wrong, you might want to listen to that instinct. Not because something terrible will definitely happen, but because there are still 5 trucks parked there, and they've been waiting a very long time for someone to finally notice. Sleep well, listeners. And if you do drive through Pennsylvania, maybe keep the radio off for that particular stretch. Some frequencies are better left unexplored.